What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the H Panel. I'm your host, Harry Potvin, and there's a couple things I would like to address before we get started on our episode today. First off, I look like a child, and this is because November is Movember. While I don't like the baby face, I love raising awareness for men's mental health, as most of you know, and of course, I decided, even though I vowed I would never fully clean shave ever again, I decided to start from scratch this year. We are, let me see the date here, November 7th. So we're 7 days in. And if you're just listening, I'll give you a little update. I still don't have a chin. I don't have a jawline that comes with the beard. But the mustache is kind of going in, growing slowly but surely. So I'll be sure to keep all of you who are so interested, I'm sure, updated on that. If you guys did want to donate to my Movember progression, the link will be in my Instagram bio. And then, of course, you know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe, give 5 stars, no matter where you're watching. Show support, comment, share it. Let me know what you think of the episode. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions. So today for this episode, I am joined by Psychotherapist Priyanka Patel. Priyanka is from Vancouver, Canada, and one of her main areas of work includes working with children and adults through trauma, crisis, and abuse situations. And that's kind of an area that we're going to target through this conversation, as well as the mental health stigma that is found in South Asian communities. I'm sure you guys will enjoy this conversation. It was very insightful. I learned a lot. I can't wait to show you guys. So without further ado, enjoy the episode, let me know what you think, and have a great rest of your day. Hello? Hi, how are you?
Good, how's it going?
Good. How's Vancouver?
It is not too bad, actually. Not great either. Our COVID numbers are getting up and up and up, so that hasn't been the best. But other than that, it's been okay.
Yeah. We just broke our own record in Ontario.
Yeah.
Woo! Great.
It's such a tough situation, because there's just so many variables, and sometimes people are doing too much, sometimes people are doing not enough, so it's also complicated.
Yeah, right, exactly. How's the weather over there?
It's actually really good.
Yeah.
We've had mild fall. I don't think we've gotten lower than maybe 4, 5 or 6 degrees. That's the coldest that's been. Oh, wow. So it's pretty fortunate. Today it's bright and sunny. I think it's 11 degrees today.
Oh, so nice.
Yeah. How about you guys?
We got snow and hail last week. So we were like, well, welcome to November. And then this week is all 18 and sunny.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I don't know where it came from. I came to work dressed for winter, and I was drenched after half an hour. I was like, what is going on?
Oh, gosh. Well, I guess, it's better late than never, so that's good.
So I know, I'm not complaining. This time last year we had 3 feet of snow, so hey, whatever. I'll take any warm weather we got.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure.
So, first and foremost, Priyanka, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. So, my first question for you, before we get there's 2 topics I want to cover today. But before we get into that, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Kind of where you grew up, what made you choose this line of work, stuff like that.
Sure, yeah. So I am a born and raised Vancouverite. Born in Vancouver, have lived in Vancouver for the majority of my life, went to university in Vancouver. So I love the city and I love everything about it. The reason that I thought to pursue counseling as a career and as a field is in part by my own personal interest in psychology and in therapy, and also in part because of my own experience with dealing with mental health issues and just kind of being a part of the healing process. So connection and health are 2 of my truest values as a person, as a practitioner, and this has been a field where I can really bring both of those 2 values together. So, understanding the importance of relationship and connection through work and through therapy, while also promoting health and mental health. This was kind of one of the fields where I saw that alignment for myself. And yeah, it's absolutely been lovely just over the last couple of years. I still consider myself a relatively new therapist. I've only been practicing for about 3.5 years. I graduated in 2017. I completed my master's.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I've only been practicing for about 3.5 years, but it's definitely been a journey. It's been awesome.
That's awesome. So the first, so that, like I said, there's two areas I want to cover. Wow, I can speak, I promise. And the first one is one that you've kind of hinted at on social media and kind of addressed in your posts, and it's the stigma surrounding mental health in South Asian communities. So that being
Mhm.
said, what is the stigma surrounding mental health in South Asian communities, and what is your personal experience with it?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of the question, Harry, the stigma around it is just that it's not something that's really well accepted, right? It's not something that's also really well understood either. And both of those two factors in combination ultimately just bring this really big sense of resistance, and kind of just like, we don't know what that is, so we're not wanting to get involved with it at all.
Mm-hmm.
If I was to kind of summarize the experience as a whole. I think typically and historically in a lot of collectivistic cultures like the South Asian culture, an individual doesn't only represent themselves in the world, they also represent their family as a whole,
Okay.
right? So their own experience, their own identity is also really closely connected to the identity of the family. So it's kind of like that really close mentality in terms of, everyone sort of being aware of what's going on for everybody else. And as you can imagine, that comes with a lot of good things and a lot of challenging things as well, because people are often really compared or held up to the values of their family rather than just what they understand or respect as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good in the sense that it's a very supportive community, a community that I'm so proud to be a part of, a culture that's very rich, very, very old in terms of its history and its roots, originally back in India and, in Asia in general. But because of that, there is a lot of patriarchy in the South Asian community as well, and it still exists. A lot of sexism that can come forward as well, and those are the parts that are being worked on. I will say that, and I do wholeheartedly believe that.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're looking at mental health, it's almost like individuals have certain expectations of them. And the family has certain expectations in the South Asian culture as well. And if you're not able to meet those expectations, due to reasons that are associated with mental health, that is very difficult to explain, right? And so another reason that the stigma exists is because, if it's a physical illness, if it's something that we can see, like let's say if a person broke their arm, right, and their arm is physically in a cast and they can't work, they can't complete their responsibilities or their duties, it's very easy for that to be explained because it's something that you can see, right? The challenge with mental health concerns is there is an injury, right? An injury has truly occurred, but it's not visible to the eye. And because of that, it's much more harder to comprehend. On top of that, so many different factors come into the picture as well, right? Someone's personality, someone's childhood, their experiences. So even if somebody has, let's say, depression or anxiety, it doesn't look the same person to person to person. The treatment is not the same person to person to person. The healing time is not the same. And so that also adds to the complexity of the nature as well. So I hope I kind of answered your question.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I guess that complexity, like how it varies from person to person, is that just kind of, it's too confusing to kind of have them address it then? Is that kind of their mentality?
I don't think it's too confusing. I think it's just difficult to understand.
Right, sorry, that's
right?
right.
Yeah, I think it's just difficult to understand. And if somebody can't really relate to it themselves individually, that makes things more complicated. Another thing is in the South Asian community, things that are very positive are spoken about very openly.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if someone graduated from university or got a new job or bought a new home, all those things are really celebrated and really discussed openly. But a lot of challenges, the tendency is to keep it within the family. Right? We don't want word to get out. We want to support each other. We want to take care of it on our own. And fundamentally, I do believe the intention behind that mentality is actually a good one, which many people don't actually say.
Right.
But I do believe that the true intention behind that mentality is good. The unfortunate part of it is it results in, discussions not being had, right? And when people don't talk about things, it individualizes everybody or alienates them.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens is if a person feels like, I'm the only one in my community who has depression because nobody talks about it, I'm the only one in my community that has anxiety because nobody talks about it. So it's very alienating, which reinforces this tendency of wanting to keep it under wraps, keep it, pressure, like not put anybody's eye on it and that kind of thing. So there's that added element as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like, well, people with, mental illness and like anxiety and depression, they already think that way to begin with. Like, I'm the only person going through it. So that added on to the fact that they're like, we don't want to talk about it. I can imagine.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and it's very complicated because there can be a lot of people involved, and again, it brings that factor back of the collectivist community, right? Is that people really feel like something's wrong with me? How will that look on my family? How will that look on my kids? How will that look on my spouse? Right? So it's not just someone often worrying about themselves, but looking at how it will land for their families. And I always talk about that a lot with my clients who are South Asian as well. That mental health and seeking treatment for mental illness or a mental health related concern is very similar to seeking treatment for any other type of concern, right? Like, let's say if a person had cancer or arthritis, we wouldn't belittle them for seeking treatment for those types of concerns. On the contrary, we would want to be supportive and encourage them, and that's what we need to do for mental health as well, right? Be supportive, encourage people, right? Really show up for the things that actually matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of answers my next question, which is a great transition.
Yes.
More specifically, though, how can we start to eliminate kind of the stigma and change the conversation of mental health in these communities, where it's more keep it under wraps and don't let anyone find out?
Yeah. So luckily, nowadays we have a lot of abilities to really get our voice heard, right? A couple of years ago, even as recently as just about 10 years ago, it really wasn't the case, right? There was no social media. There was no way for people to connect as individuals and also for communities to collect as a whole. But, one of the good things about being able to connect with people much more easily is that conversations that haven't been had in the past are being had now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And oftentimes, what I hear people say is, is the rate of depression increasing, or are more people being diagnosed, or are more people experiencing trauma? But I don't actually think that it's the fact that the numbers are genuinely actually increasing. It's just that people are talking about it more often and more publicly than they ever have before. And so the conversation is unavoidable or unignorable, right? It's in your face. It's whether you want to discuss it or not. It's being presented to you. And so I think that's a really good thing as well in terms of how the destigmatization process can also occur. But it's also a very, very day-to-day process as well, right? So as a practitioner, I think I have a big responsibility in this destigmatization process, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that comes in the form of encouraging, clients to talk to their family members about it, encouraging clients to talk to their children about it, because that's the most important part, right? Being able to pass on good messages to the next generation, right? Because they're going to be the ones that are going to be shaping the world of the future and the way that we understand things, right? Another really good thing is the media in general, not just social media, has improved quite a bit. There's still a lot of improvement that needs to happen, but they've improved quite a bit in really capturing real stories of people who are struggling, and not just portraying them in a very negative light, as it has been the case historically. Right. So they're demonstrating how people are still extremely high functioning despite their mental health challenges. They're demonstrating how people are really successfully overcoming challenges. Right. We see so many shows about that on Netflix. So many amazing, really inspirational films. Like, I'm a huge fan of Batman, and that's like an aside note. But if you actually even look at the films of Batman, particularly this film that came out of the Joker very recently, a lot of controversy spiked around that. But what they were demonstrating in that film is someone who has grown up in an environment of a lot of childhood trauma, right? And obviously that's a very extreme example of what can kind of happen. But, and that movie is an aside. But what it really did was it sparked so many conversations around mental health, right, around resources, around what is available, what is not available, how do people fall through, the cracks, which is basically what happened to that character in that film, right? He essentially fell through the cracks. And, in extreme cases, what can happen if that becomes the norm, right? So things like that, even things that seemingly may not be connected, are really speaking about a very, very important topic. So I think all of those things in combination are really what's made a big difference. And even, specifically for South Asians, a lot of South Asian films are really addressing some, topics that were previously considered, maybe that were just ignored or uncomfortable for people to talk about, like drug culture in India, what drug culture really means. Right now, just a couple of months ago, there was a very, very famous Bollywood actor, Sushant Rajput, who passed away. He committed suicide.
Oh, man.
And his death was very, very traumatizing and devastating for the entire country. And everybody experienced that death in a very big way, just because it was a suicide and because, he expressed in the very end part of his life that he was struggling with depression. And just the way that mental health is looked at in a very few short months has completely changed, right? So it doesn't really necessarily always take a long time. And sometimes these catalyst events are so big and so impactful that they just motivate a whole movement, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I had a point, and I was gonna say it, and I completely
sorry. I think I spoke too much.
No. You that was great. That was perfect. I am so mad I forgot. It was a great. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Okay, you'll think of it.
It'll come back around. Awesome. Yeah, no, that I completely agree. I know, as cliche as it sounds, like conversation is the first big step towards destigmatization and like normalizing mental health struggles. It sounds really cliche, and I know some people, myself included, sometimes when you hear that, like, just talk about it, conversate, you roll your eyes a little. But I remember my point just saying that.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, so I actually had this conversation a couple days ago with some friends. And like you said before, mental illness was kind of portrayed as this negative thing. Like people, it is important, don't get me wrong, to talk about the struggles that you go through and like the low periods, but they would only focus on that as opposed to, how these people, recovered, got out of it, figured out how to work with what's going on in their head. And I feel like that whole area of conversation needs to be highlighted more, especially when, like you said, when you're talking to the younger generation, because all they know, if let's say they experience some stress or they experience, a low period, all they know is, crap, I'm just like that person I saw who had a really bad low period and is still struggling with it. I don't know how to deal with this. And that's kind of what I went through, except I never had like that person to look to, even like I never looked at someone who was like, hey, I was going through something, it was a really low point. It was never talked about. So when I got that stress and I got that depression, I thought my world's done. Like, I'm done because I'm in this period. I don't know how to work with it. So talking to the younger generation about, you can actually get through it, and this is how you work with it, and these are some tips and techniques that might work for you. I feel like that is so important, because then the younger generation will grow up, and when they face adversity, they're like, I know how to deal with it now. So my next area of conversation my next topic that I really wanted to address, is a side of mental health that I don't have much knowledge in, and I kind of want to learn about, and it's one of your fields of studies. So my first question is really general, but what is trauma and what kind of causes it to happen?
So that's a really broad question.
I know.
So I'll try to summarize it in as succinct of a way as possible. So essentially, trauma occurs. First of all, everybody experiences trauma at some point in their lives. So it's not fair to sort of assume that only some people have trauma and other people don't have trauma. Mm-hmm. Living in this world, especially in this day and age, means that we are all going to be exposed to trauma at some point or another. But trauma essentially is an experience that occurs, or something that we witness, or something that we can maybe even hear about that really deeply and emotionally impacts us, and damages the way that our brain sort of perceives the world, particularly our threat detection system. right? So trauma often, when something happens that really threatens our feeling of being safe or our feeling of being comfortable, or threatens our body's belief in being able to keep itself safe, that's when, a lot of really challenging situations can come about. So what do I mean when I say challenges the body's belief that it can't keep itself safe? So, the body really functions on this understanding that we have, the fight, the flight, the flight. Oh my gosh, I'm losing my words. The fight, the flight system. And nowadays in modern language, we also include that, I have expanded that to include the freeze and the fawn systems as well in the brain. And what all of that encompasses is our ability to keep ourselves safe and act in ways that's in our best interest. And when that safety mechanism fails or doesn't work or isn't able to keep us safe, the body kind of feels betrayed by itself, right? And that type of experience can be very, very challenging. It happens to folks that maybe are, just crossing the street and maybe they get hit by a car. It happens to survivors of assault, right? We have abilities to protect ourselves. We want to keep ourselves safe and protected. So if that can't happen, then that's when all these challenges kind of arise. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what are some symptoms that can be experienced when dealing with trauma? Like what are some signs that it might be happening to someone you know?
Yeah. So there's kind of like a clinical definition of some symptoms, but then in talk therapy, we also look at behaviors that often can result from trauma as well. So I'll talk about both aspects. So in terms of very clinical symptoms that a person can exhibit, we often find that people experience flashbacks, either while awake or while they're sleeping, very vivid ones about the experience. Sometimes there can be a triggering event, a scent, a sight, a person, a location that can really bring on a sense of panic or anxiety associated with the trauma. Sometimes, the brain might not even be able to remember the experience because in an attempt to protect itself, sometimes the brain kind of glosses over some memories, which is why you hear some trauma survivors say, I don't really remember what happened, or I don't really remember who was involved, or don't really remember what happened to me. And that's kind of why. So kind of fragmented memory is another symptom often that can come up. In general, engaging in some avoidance behaviors, like not wanting to interact with certain people, not wanting to go to certain places, not wanting to interact with certain folks or individuals who are involved in a certain event, that kind of thing. Those could be symptoms as well. Oftentimes, we may feel depression or anxiety associated with trauma, especially if we're in a cycle of trauma that's kind of perpetuating as well. If it was a trauma that occurred in the childhood, sometimes the way that it shows up is relationally. So in our relationships as adults, with our friends, with our partners, with our family, sometimes that's how the trauma can show up as well. So when we're looking at trauma clinically, and if one was to make a diagnosis for post-traumatic stress, we drop the disorder. At least not in my practice. We don't use the language of disorder. We just consider it as trauma response, or so we say post-traumatic responses, not disorder. So if one was to get that diagnosis, these would be like the classifications that we would look at. In therapy, when we're doing talk therapy, it's not really super helpful to just look at those kind of concrete symptoms. So we take a step further. We look at behaviors. So if we kind of break it down into those 4 categories, I recently actually made a post about this just a few days ago. But the 4 kind of categories that we break it down into are fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. So in fight, that's pretty self-explanatory, right? Those really explosive behaviors, aggressive stances, really verbally abusive, that type of language could be indicative of some sort of trauma. The flight behaviors, right? Always kind of engaging in escapism or avoidance, right? Not really wanting to deal with things directly, or purposefully engaging in distractions like working extra long hours so that you don't have to interact with certain things could be a sign of it in terms of action. In terms of the freeze, right? Just really numbing down, engaging. Perhaps that's where the depression would show up, right? Not really wanting to interact or associate with anybody. And the fawn is ultimately kind of shown in like those people-pleasing behaviors, right? If that's kind of the trauma that you experienced in your life, perhaps even in childhood, where you had to please somebody, a caregiver, or something like that. That's how those behaviors can sometimes manifest.
Mm-hmm.
So in talk therapy, we look at these actions as indicators of trauma.
Wow, right on, man. Yeah, sorry, I don't have much input because I don't know much about it.
That's okay. That's fine. I think that was a lot of info, but
No, that was
that's
great.
kind of how we would conceptualize it. Like I would conceptualize it in my work.
Right, nice. And then kind of on the other side of it, like on a personal level, uh, how would like an individual be able to personally identify trauma before it gets too severe or dangerous to ourselves?
Well, usually it's kind of a feeling, right? So trauma really lives in the body.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times people are quite aware that they've gone through something pretty traumatic. Even if they don't have the exact memory or the recall of it, because it happened, their brain maybe blocked it out or it happened a long time ago. The body has a kind of way of telling us that something happened based on how we feel in the moment. So that's something to consider as well. A lot of the folks that I work with, to be very honest, I'd say around at least 80 or 85% of the clients that I work with are very aware of their experiences that they've gone through and the traumas that they've experienced, be it in their childhood or their adult lives, in their relationship, at their workplace, while driving, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So most people have a pretty sound sense, and for a lot of people, typically the traumatic incidences are exactly that, an incident or several incidences that happened at different times. For certain folks who have more complex trauma, complex post-traumatic stress, often might have been in abusive situations for a very long period of time, and so that's a little bit further advanced. But yeah, I think a lot of the times people know, they know. And it's and really anything that kind of disturbs you or makes you feel uncomfortable, or you find yourself ruminating or thinking about it for a couple of days afterwards, might have kind of traumatized you a little bit in some way.
Yeah, right. Um, it so would is there like a certain amount of people who like they know what happened, but when they come to you, it kind of gets like the puzzle kind of gets put together. Like they didn't realize it affected them as much as it did.
Yeah, that happens really often. A lot of times, what happens is, people find that they've had experiences in their lives, and then they're so used to being in these types of environments, and then they kind of go to school, start working, and then get busy in their lives, and suddenly I hear this a lot from people, things are going really really well, and that's when all these trauma symptoms come to the surface. Right after everything happened, after everything's going well, that's when everything kind of comes to the surface. And so I hear that a lot of times, and people aren't really sure. Like they felt like, well, I already dealt with my trauma. I already addressed it. I was doing so well. I was working. I was doing this. I was doing that. So, how come this is happening? How come it's coming up again now for me? And so, a lot of times that can happen for people. A lot of times, and to be fair, everybody's different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some people have different abilities, other people have different skills and resiliencies that makes them better able to cope with trauma. And we often see that in the fact that two people can go through the exact same incident, right? And one person can be severely impacted for the rest of their lives, and another person might be impacted to a degree for a little while, and then they heal, they get better, they move on, right? So everybody has different resiliencies towards trauma, and so we have to be really sensitive to that as well, right? Just because something traumatic happened to somebody, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the main causal factor for challenges that they may be facing in the present. And any good trauma therapist will be able to recognize that and know that, right? Is in that it's really the client's decision as to whether or not they want to process their trauma, because some people simply don't. They feel like it's in the past, they dealt with it, they lived through it,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't want to go down that road again because they don't feel like that's what's meaningful and valid for them. And you have to respect that, right? Because
Right.
everyone's journey is very much their own, and we are in no place to kind of dictate, it is trauma and you are traumatized and we need to discuss it and talk about it, right? Like that's not the approach.
Right. Does that differentiation between clients, does that raise any difficulties for you? Like, is it hard to just because each person's different, is it tough to kind of find ways to address that trauma?
Well, the truth is the same can be said for addressing any mental health concern.
Right.
Right? Depression looks different for every person. Anxiety looks different for every person. Trauma looks different for every person. Stress looks different for every person, right? So the same can be said for any type of mental health concern. And that's what makes it complicated, I think, is because people are unique. Everybody's experiences are unique. The resources people have are different, right? Some people, find it very easy to cope and heal because they have access to they have a secure job, they have insurance, they can go to a doctor frequently. They can access counseling, which is unfortunately sometimes, not cheap. They can access that and get the help that they need and be able to support themselves really well. They're connected, they have family that they can talk to, and some people simply don't have that, right? So everything is going to manifest differently for different people, right? Some people have the ability to buy a gym membership or sign up for fitness classes, and that's really, supportive to their own mental health and their own concerns. And for other people, that's not the case, right? So it's different. There's no one glove fits all approach in mental health.
Right. No, definitely not. So what, if you're a family member or a peer or a friend of someone who has experienced trauma or is, going through the recovery process, what are some do's and don'ts for these people?
So I think we need to have an open mind and be able to understand where someone is coming from and be able to be respectful to let them know that they know what's in their best interests, right? Even if it might not be what we agree on, it might not be what we think they should or should not be doing. We need to understand and just resolve the fact that different people have different ways of coping. And, the best thing that we can do is listen and be a support. And what we should avoid is kind of trying to influence the direction that people are going when it comes to their healing. We can always give suggestions like, have you considered accessing therapy, or have you considered going to this group, or have you considered signing up for this online resource? But sometimes we become too prescriptive, and that's really unhelpful. And the same can be said for a lot of people in a lot of different scenarios. So that's kind of the challenge. And I think when you have a loved one who's going through a particular challenge, you want to be involved, you want to be there and supporting them. And sometimes that energy, which is well intentioned, can kind of make us really rigid or very uncompromising. So we just have to kind of watch that and catch that as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I know when I opened up to some people, their intentions were good, like you said, but they were like, you have to do this, you have to do that. And the last thing I wanted to do was the thing they told me to do.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's what makes the situation much more complicated, is that people have good intentions, but because they're so concerned for the person, or because they feel like I went through it and this is where I messed up, so I don't want that to happen to this person, right? They really end up being too prescriptive, but that's not super helpful to anybody.
And it's so tough, right? Like when you're on the outside looking in and you're trying to
Yeah,
help them, but you can only do so much. Like there's a fine
yeah,
line there that you
totally.
can't cross.
Yeah.
So in a time like right now, of course, with the election, COVID, um, the pandemic, like everything, and the fact that the media is kind of pushing out all this negative news, and you're locked inside your house just seeing this, it's really hard for people to kind of keep hope and kind of keep mentally healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So my first part of this question is, what are the potential effects of this pandemic on someone's mental health? And how can we stay mentally healthy during this time? And then the second part of that question is, how can one keep hope in a time like now where it seems almost impossible to have?
Okay, yeah. Well, so for the first thing that you asked, what are the mental health implications? It's hard to say because we've never faced a pandemic before, a global pandemic like this one. So it's really hard to kind of give an answer in terms of what the long term effects are going to be, because the real answer is we don't know, right? We haven't been through this before. We don't really have any information to kind of draw off of. So I can't really speak to that too much. In terms of what challenges people are facing now, obviously people are feeling a lot more anxious. A lot of compulsive behaviors might be being reinforced as a result of the messages that we're getting, like wash your hands frequently, maintain physical distance, right? People who have already concerns around that area might find them a bit exacerbated. But in terms of how people can stay mentally well, it's not super complicated, right? Like, we need to just focus on our own well-being and take care of ourselves in the best way that we can. And it's all really basic stuff, right? Staying connected to our family and our friends, however we can do so safely. Doing all the procedures to make sure we ourselves are safe and healthy, following them to the best of our ability, right? Staying informed, but with good boundaries, not excessively watching the news 24/7 because that's not healthy, or constantly scrolling through social media because that's not healthy, right? But having good boundaries and relying on good informed sources to provide our information. Even conversations we're having with friends and family, like if COVID comes up, we should talk about it because it's not something that needs to be ignored. But then also putting a cap on it and saying, okay, we're done. We're leaving that off to the side now. Let's talk about other things so it doesn't get overwhelming. Right? Making sure we have our work, whatever work we're doing, we're invested, we're doing the best that we can in that type of sense. Making sure we're getting good exercise, however that's possible, safely. A lot of studios are open. They have excellent safety precautions and procedures. So doing our research before we go and making sure we're going to be safe when we get there is a good one. Being outside, if that's what you feel comfortable doing, right? Eating properly is a big one. Our meals at regular times. And then, of course, sleep, right? A lot of our mental health, a lot of our mental health and wellness is associated with how we're sleeping. So if we're sleeping well and if we're doing, managing our sleep hygiene strategies well, and that's going to be something that makes a big difference also.
Awesome. And those are all the questions I've got. Thank you so much for joining me today. That was great. Yeah, no, that was probably, I'm just going to say, it's probably one of my favorite episodes. I learned a lot today. So.
Oh, wow.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no worries. I'll let you go. But sure. Have a great rest of your day and we'll talk soon.
Okay, thank you so much.
Right.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for watching another episode of the H Panel. I really appreciate you guys. For more episodes of the H Panel, click this button right here. And if you want to subscribe for more videos from myself, subscribe is right down below. Thanks, guys.